April 1943, Camp Hereford, Texas. A dull pencil scraped across cheap paper as Serente Joseph Morelli forced steady letters onto the page, words that wouldn't reach his mother in Sicily for 8 long months. Only a few weeks earlier, he would have called those sentences fantasy. Mama, they treat us like guests, not prisoners. White bread every day, meat, vegetables, more than we saw in 2 years of war. Through the barracks window, he stared out at a horizon stitched with electric light, tractors chewing furrows across the flats, American guards leaning on a fence trading cigarettes with Italian POWs. Everything he had been told about a new Roman Empire rising, about a United States too divided and soft to stand, was cracking. In captivity, Italian soldiers were meeting a country that existed beyond propaganda, loud, abundant, confident. When the first Italian prisoners stepped off trains at Camp Hereford in April 1943, they joined roughly 51,000 Italians who would reach American soil before war's end. The stream had started back in November 1942 when the Allies struck North Africa. Men captured in Tunisia, many from General Giovanni Mace's First Army as it collapsed after months without supplies, were bundled into collection points and processed. They braced for beatings, starvation, and backbreaking labor. Instead, the first shock was clinical, a medical exam, the kind thoroughness they hadn't seen in years, real treatment for old wounds, uniforms swapped out for clean clothing. Then came the meal, white bread, canned meat, coffee sweetened with sugar, sometimes chocolate. After so long on survival rations, the taste felt almost unreal. The journey to America delivered contradiction after contradiction. Liberty ships that had hurried material to Europe sailed back with human cargo. By the summer of 1943, up to 30,000 POWs per month. For many, the 2-week crossing became a classroom. These massive cargo vessels, churned out by American yards at an industrial tempo Italy could not dream of, carried radar sets the Italians had glimpsed only on elite British ships. In the galley, American sailors scooped ice cream from humming machines, brewed coffee all day, tore into fresh bread, threw away leftovers with the casual waste of a people who knew there would be more tomorrow. On the deck, prisoners watched a production line ocean, the ship convoyed inside an empire of cranes, docks, tugboats, and signals. They disembarked at places like Norfolk, Virginia, and West Coast ports and stepped into scale. Docks stretched for miles. Electric cranes swung cargo nets that would have taken dozens of men to haul in Italy. The parking lots were full. Ordinary workers drove cars. Buildings everywhere were wired. Stores were stocked with goods that had vanished from Italian shelves years earlier. They were moved inland not in cattle cars, but in passenger coaches lit by electric bulbs, with padded seats and dining cars. Town after town slid past the windows, each with the same arteries of paved roads, the same storefronts, the same restaurants, the same power lines humming even at night. Factories ran without stopping. Even far-off farms wore the bright geometry of irrigation and tractors. Camp Hereford, designated for Italian prisoners, sat among other Texas facilities like Camp Hereford, which held mostly Germans. Hereford's perimeter bristled with barbed wire and guarded towers, but inside there were 4 compounds with barracks, mess halls, and an infirmary. At the peak, 3,160 men lived there, including 2,580 Italians. The structures were plain but startlingly functional. Electric lights that clicked on at a switch, hot showers, flush toilets, heating that actually kept out the Texas cold. The hospital held equipment many hadn't seen since before the war. X-ray machines, modern surgical tools, and disinfectants that didn't smell like despair. Yes, there were ugly moments, especially toward those identified as hardline fascists. But for most, daily life meant a bed off the ground, a schedule, and food. The food, above all. 3 meals a day with meat and vegetables and milk, and sometimes a dessert that tasted like a holiday. On special days, the kitchen crew turned out extravagant spreads, and the trash cans filled with more calories than entire families back home received in a week. To the men who had learned to be suspicious of good fortune, abundance itself became disorienting. Then everything shifted on September 8, 1943. Italy surrendered and signed an armistice. On October 13th, Italy declared war on Germany. Overnight, the Italians in American camps moved from enemy to something new, co-belligerents. In February 1944, the U.S. Army Service Forces offered a choice: stay as prisoners or volunteer for Italian Service Units, ISU, for non-combat roles supporting Allied operations. Of the 51,000 Italians held in the United States, more than 45,000 volunteered. They signed pledges to assist against their former German allies and received privileges that changed everything. Their uniforms were nearly identical to American issue, but carried an Italy patch on the left sleeve and the standard garrison cap. They earned $24 per month, a third in cash, and the rest in base script redeemable at the PX. It wasn't much, but to men who had nothing, it felt like a seed of independence. California, still taut from the Pacific War through the end of 1945, welcomed them with surprising warmth. The state's large Italian-American communities, descended from fishermen, farmers, and winemakers dating back to the gold rush, opened doors. The story that traveled furthest was about the Italian POWs on Angel Island, who rented a hall in San Francisco with their own money and hosted Saturday night dances. Chaperones kept a watchful eye, but American women came anyway, eager to talk to the stylish young men with rolling R's and practiced manners. For a few hours, the war loosened its grip. By day, the same men traveled into the fields that fed a continent. The Central Valley was not a farm in the way Italians understood the word. It was a machine made of soil and water. A single property dwarfed whole provinces. Mechanical harvesters performed the work of hundreds of hands. Perfect fruit went to market. Blemishes were discarded. Some crops were plowed under to keep prices steady. That kind of waste would have prevented hunger in Italy. In America, it signaled a platform so strong it could afford to be inefficient sometimes. Work widened from farms to ports, canneries, depots, and maintenance yards. Italian ISU teams loaded ships for the invasion of Europe, kept vehicles running, and saved harvests that might have rotted. Their contribution was staggering. Over 90 million man-days of labor between 1943 and 1945, saving the U.S. government an estimated $230 million and freeing thousands of Americans for combat duty. In the Brooklyn Army Terminal, Italian stacked crates pointed toward liberation. Every pallet lifted felt like one more step toward a Rome unshackled from German occupation. When news of the June 6, 1944 landings in Normandy reached the camps, the cheer was genuine, contradictory only on the surface. These were former enemies, yes, but also the soldiers who would drive Nazis out of Italian cities. 2 days earlier, on June 4th, 1944, Rome had fallen, and Italians and Italian Americans celebrated together in churches and town squares across the United States. At Camp Hereford, a victory mass brought thousands, prisoners and locals side by side. Not everything was logistics and labor. It was also ritual and remembrance. American guards and commanders attended memorial services when prisoners received letters about family killed in bombing raids back home. Local families adopted men who had no one to write to, inviting them for Sunday dinners or to sit in a pew on holidays. Christmas 1943 carried a particular ache and sweetness. Civic groups sent care packages, cigarettes, toiletries, chocolate, even by American standards, luxuries in wartime. Churches arranged midnight mass in Latin and Italian. Carols filled barracks and chapels. The Christmas meal featured turkey and ham, and sides upon sides, and dessert on dessert. It wasn't just the calories. It was the message. You are human beings, and we will treat you as such. Education followed. By 1944, classes in English, American history, math, and trades were common in many camps. Universities set up correspondence programs. Life grew cultural texture. Theater companies popped up. Orchestras practiced. Camp newspapers matured from thin bulletins into publications that debated democracy, economics, and the future of Europe. Across the country, Italian craftsmen did what Italians have done for centuries. They left beauty behind: fountains, murals, small chapels. One chapel built at Camp Hereford in 1945 honored 5 men who died there. Its concrete worked to mimic marble, a gesture to dignity that outlasted the war itself. On the East Coast, March 1944 brought 1,800 ISU members to Boston. The first welcome was chilly, especially in South Boston, where Italian Americans who had built careful reputations bristled at the idea of new arrivals with POW status humiliating the community. The mood changed when work began. Italians at the port sang in church choirs, cooked at festivals, and introduced recipes that second-generation Italian Americans had never tasted in their original form. When tensions lingered, 1,300 were transferred to Peddocks Island in Boston Harbor. Trustee privileges allowed some to take Sunday boats into the North End, where Italian-American families set tables with the good dishes and sat them down to pasta and stories. Some of the most lasting connections were personal. Regulations forbade marriage between POWs and American citizens, but human beings are not checklists. Priests looked the other way. Dances continued. Letters piled up in camp mailrooms. By war's end, there were couples who had waited faithfully on 2 continents. Many American women followed their sweethearts to Italy after repatriation, married there, then returned years later as the wives of legal immigrants. Less than 1% of Italian prisoners attempted escape. The vast majority chose duty and dignity over flight, a statistic that says as much about treatment as it does about character. Numbers alone tell a story of magnitude. By May 1945, the United States held 425,071 POWs, 371,683 Germans, 50,273 Italians, and 3,915 Japanese. Of the Italians, 51,000 were spread across 21 camps in 18 states. Their work, 90 million man-days, did more than save money. It kept crops from spoiling, kept ships on schedule, kept a war machine moving. And 45,000 joined the Italian service units, a staggering rate of participation for men who had worn the other uniform only months before. Repatriation began late in 1945, but rolled out slowly. The country needed hands to navigate the pivot from war to peace. Many Italians weren't eager to board the ships anyway. Italy lay shattered. Friends in America had become family. Paychecks promised stability. When departures did come, entire towns came to the gate. Newspaper headlines called them friends, not prisoners. Between December 1945 and July 1946, they sailed home carrying more than a duffel bag. They took with them a crash course in democracy and practical methods, how a port schedules ships, how a cannery reduces waste, how a farm coordinates people and machines, how a town council solves a problem without a uniform at the table. A promise had been made in countless letters and handshakes. Come back. Many did. Employers filed sponsorships because they knew the men's skill. Families offered spare rooms. Fiancés stood at train platforms with a nervous grin. Former POWs built businesses on both coasts, often in food and import-export. They were natural bridges between Italy and America, fluent in more than language, fluent in expectation. Their children and grandchildren learned that identity can be both and. A son might grow up going to Mass in English and Italian, running a restaurant that served food from a village he had never seen and a city he knew by heart. Alongside the economic tale ran a quieter, personal one. Studies would later note that Italian prisoners who spent the war in America reported lower levels of depression and trauma than compatriots who endured the conflict outside the wire. It wasn't simply the absence of combat. It was the presence of purpose. Useful work replaces the gnawing emptiness of waiting. Education turns a day into a step. Social integration makes a person more than a number. And after Italy's surrender, the shift from enemy to ally restored dignity. Many sons would recall how their fathers spoke, astonishingly, well of their captivity. That optimism echoed inside families, shaping how children saw the world, how they judged other nations, how they chose their own futures. The Italian experience in American camps did more than transform individuals. It sketched a blueprint for winning hearts and minds. It succeeded not by drenching men in lectures, but by letting them live inside a functioning democracy. They saw that prosperity didn't arrive at gunpoint. It grew out of laws, habits, compromise, and a relentless cultivation of capacity. They watched ordinary workers with cars in the parking lot, farms wired with electricity, factories that never slept. And they felt kindness from people who owed them nothing. A guard who stood beside a casket at a memorial mass, a family who kept an extra chair at Sunday dinner, a church choir that learned an Italian hymn because a stranger asked. The contrast with German POWs underscores the power and limits of context. Many Germans, even with similar food and facilities, held fast to Nazi ideology. Italians, shaped by a different culture, redefined by the 1943 armistice, supported by Catholic and Italian-American networks, were ready to pivot. They became co-belligerents in spirit as well as on paper. There were markers of their presence then, and there are markers now. Bocce courts in unexpected towns trace their origins to wartime afternoons, when Italians rolled heavy balls across a dirt lane outside a barracks. Recipes entered family cookbooks. A red sauce taught to a neighbor, a technique for stretching dough into a pizza that crisped just right. An espresso pulled on a contraption that started as a novelty and became a morning ritual decades before the nation learned the names of coffee sizes. In Hereford, Texas, the chapel built in 1945 still stands, concrete pretending to be marble, honest in its imitation and beautiful in its purpose. In California's Central Valley, wineries founded by former POWs or their descendants bottle the same stubbornness that carried men across an ocean and into a new life. Consider a day late in the war. July 16th, 1944, when the 38th and 40th Italian Quartermaster Service Companies arrived at Rock Island Arsenal by train from Pine Camp, New York. They were there to maintain, to move, to keep the machine humming. They did so well that when peace came, commanders asked, sometimes begged, that repatriation be delayed. Capability erases suspicion. Competence builds trust. A soldier who keeps your supply line from stalling is not an abstraction. He's a teammate. Even the statistics at the end of the story hold the shape of a lesson. Less than 1% attempted escape. Thousands kept writing to American families after the war. Many returned with visas and built lives that now reach into third and fourth generations. Sister city relationships that pair American and Italian towns grew out of those letters and visits. Trade blossomed. Techniques seen on American factory floors and farms fed Italy's post-war recovery, fertilizing what would become the country's economic miracle in the 1950s and 1960s. American businesses profited from partners who could navigate two cultures with ease, and the $230 million saved in wartime labor was only the down payment. The true return stretched out across decades of exchange. Starting in the 1970s, former Italian POWs gathered for reunions in the United States. They didn't celebrate captivity. They celebrated transformation. The 1988 gathering at Camp Hereford drew hundreds of former prisoners and thousands of Americans who had known them. Old men who once stood on opposite sides of a barbed wire fence embraced and cried, and grandkids chased each other under the Texas sun. Speeches were short and grateful. A man thanked an American nurse for an operation that saved his leg. Another recalled a guard who slipped him a letter when the censors were slow and a sister's wedding was near. A third told a story about a dance in San Francisco and a girl he married in Naples and brought back to the U.S. 5 years later. These were not legends polished by nostalgia. They were practical testaments to the power of being treated like a person. Why did so many Italians call the American camps almost paradise? Not because the wire disappeared, or because war turned into a vacation. Paradise, in their telling, meant comparison. Against the hunger, terror, and lies they had survived, the camps revealed possibility. Food on a plate 3 times a day. Work that mattered. A priest who could say Mass without permission from a party official. A film in the evening. A class that made the future feel less like fog. A paycheck, even with restrictions, that proved their labor had value. They learned that a system that feeds its enemies is a system confident in victory. In the end, the legacy lives in places and in people. The camps mostly vanished back into fields or suburbs, but Hereford's chapel remains. Bocce courts in parks from California to Massachusetts still echo with laughter and low-voiced arguments about the last throw. Italian festivals flourish in towns that once hosted men in uniform from far away. And in countless homes, a family tree includes a name that crossed the ocean in chains and stayed by choice. They arrived as soldiers of a failed empire. They left as builders. They came as prisoners. They discovered a way of life. In that discovery, 2 nations built a friendship that has outlasted war and outlived propaganda. The lesson is plain and demanding. Power convinces, but example converts. In those years, the United States won a different kind of victory by opening its hand instead of closing a fist, by offering food, work, worship, and dignity. Italian prisoners walked out of America not rehearsing slogans, but carrying habits. They brought back to Italy practical knowledge, how to organize a warehouse, how to manage a harvest, how to run a city meeting, but also an intuition that freedom can feed a family, that diversity makes a nation stronger, that opportunity beats intimidation every time. April 1943 is a long way behind us. The pencil lines in Morelli's letter have faded, but if you listen, you can still hear the scrape of graphite on paper and see a young man pausing over a sentence he knows his mother will hardly believe. "Mama, they feed us like we are guests." He wasn't praising a prison. He was naming a revelation, and that revelation, shared across 51,000 Italian souls scattered through 21 camps in 18 states, helped plant democratic roots that would bear fruit for generations, on both sides of the Atlantic.